Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Agus Ramirez. In case you missed it, last September 30, we celebrated International Podcast Day. Her Story Southeast Asia was included in Tatler Asia's Front and Female Editors Picks, the best podcasts by women and for women by Rachel Duffel. I'll link the article in the description so you can check out that list. Thank you, Tatler Asia. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that's quite a bit darker than our recent topics. This is going to be about the slave trade in women and children in French Indochina. While it's difficult to talk about, it is necessary. Please make sure that you're in the correct headspace to engage with this topic. And if you're not, no worries. I'll see you in the next one. Also, I've seen other content creators say this recently, so I'm gonna do it too. This is not an AI channel. I, and occasionally another researcher, read the material and write everything ourselves. If I were using AI, or if AI were capable of doing any of this, I would be producing more content, no? But as a tiny independent podcast, it takes time and life gets in the way. I recently left my job of 5 years and started a new exciting one in media tech. So that's why it's been flaky in production over here. Thank you for still being here, though, despite the wild year I've been having. So, yes, no AI is used here except to clean up the sound quality as it is part of the recording software that I use. Now, on to the episode. In 1885, a Scottish journalist named James George Scott was writing about the pacification campaigns in what was then known as French Indochina. He reported that in the village of Mongkai, quote, every 100 yards or so, one comes across extensive go-downs where are stored up goods stolen and carried off from all parts of the Gulf, balls of opium, bales of silk and cotton, rice, salt, peanut oil, tea, cinnamon, all the produce of the neighboring countries. These are separated and heaped up together, for Mongkai does no paltry counter business. Nothing but full cargoes can be got from the business-like allies of the pirate and smuggler. Unquote. So far, nothing out of the ordinary, just an account of the expected trade in a fledgling colony. But then he goes on to say, here and there also are training houses for the kidnapped women, mostly Vietnamese, where they are educated up to the Chinese ways, taught accomplishments, and sprucened up for the market. James George Scott, what do you mean? Why are you being so casual about kidnapped women, training houses, and slave markets? Well, to be fair to our journalist here, by the time the French colonial rule began in Vietnam in 1885, there were already marketplaces where Vietnamese women were sold or bartered. In fact, as early as the mid-1870s, there were already such documented cases of human trafficking. Before we go further into this topic, let's talk about the word human trafficking first. Human trafficking is a modern term, but the act itself existed for a very long time. The United Nations defines human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Human trafficking for the purpose of slavery is the general topic we're dealing with here, although we need to remember that slavery is a European term. As Anthony Reid said in Slavery, Bondage, and Dependency in Southeast Asia, the word slavery should not be confused with forms of servitude found in Southeast Asia. But to keep things simple, for our purposes in this episode, we are talking about forcibly taking people, in this case women and children, from one area and transporting them to another to enslave them for commercial purposes. In short, we are talking about the slave trade. Okay, so before the colonizers came to Southeast Asia, there were various forms of slavery already happening. The following are some of the documented cases. We'll go through this a bit quickly, okay? In Thailand, slavery was a part of Thai society from the Sukhothai period to 17th century Ayutthaya and beyond. In the Philippines, the coastal regions of the Visayas and Luzon in modern Philippines were regularly raided by the Iranun and Balangingi ethnic groups who killed the men and took the women as captives. In Indonesia, there was a slave trade in women in the Dutch East Indies. On the island of Bali, slavery, including hereditary slavery, was common. Women could become enslaved by the Rajas for a number of reasons. Bali served as a slavery zone for women, providing slaves for Chinese and Dutch clients in Batavia, now Jakarta. Balinese women were favored for their beauty and because they could cook and eat pork as they practiced Hinduism, unlike the Muslim Javanese. Now enter the colonial period, which has been the focus of our season 2. In Indonesia, Dutch officials in the Dutch East Indies fed off the slave trade to keep harems. This was because local nobility had harems and they wanted to be like them to increase their social status by copying the practice. One Dutch official was reported to have had as many as 50 slaves, though I couldn't find a name for him. Slaves were traded out of the Dutch East Indies after the Dutch signed contracts with local rulers in Maluku for the provision of slaves. The slaving zones included Seram, Timor, Borneo, Buru, Papua, Bali, and South Sulawesi. They were traded westwards to Mauritius in the Indian Ocean and northwards to Macau. In the Philippines, under Spanish rule during the 17th century, it was illegal for Spanish colonists to keep the indigenous peoples of the Philippines as slaves. However, this led to the increased importation of slaves from elsewhere, including child slaves from Timor, China, Japan, and India. English and Dutch traders in Southeast Asia also brought in slaves from outside of the region, including India, Arakan, Madagascar, and New Guinea, because the isolation and distance would make it less likely for them to run away. This shit is dark. Finally, Portuguese traders during the 16th century enslaved Japanese girls and then traded them into Southeast Asia. An anti trafficking decree implemented in Kyoto in 1616 tried to suppress the buying and selling of women, but it didn't really work. So in 1636, all Japanese were banned from leaving Japan, and in 1639, the Portuguese, along with the Japanese wives, were expelled from Japan. Very important side note, Japanese prostitutes in the 1600s had permission to visit Chinese and Dutch clients, provided they didn't stay overnight. They were known as Karayuki-san. Put a pin in that, we will come back to this later. For a more detailed discussion of this topic, you can read Julia Martinez's Mapping the Trafficking of Women Across Colonial Southeast Asia, 1600s to 1930s. Her article also talks about how colonial governments dealt with the slave trade once slavery became less acceptable. We're going to focus now on French colonial Indochina. And here, we're drawing heavily on the work of Micheline Lasalde, specifically how Vietnamese women in Hanoi were taken to China either by deception or force to be sold as slaves. Like I said, we know that in the 1870s, the slave trade already existed. We know this because of the French Catholic missionaries in places like Tonkin and Annam who were actively trying to help the victims. Of course, the slave trade was happening everywhere, but these missionaries were only able to help those in areas where they had a strong presence. Here are some of their stories. In 1873, French Catholic missionaries in Tonkin reported that Vietnamese women and children were frequently being kidnapped. Bishop Monsignor Gauthier complained that the coast of Tonkin had become a dangerous area where pirates went inland from their ships in order to pillage and burn villages and often to kidnap women and children. In 1875, Bishop Zéphyrin Guillemin mentioned that one of his fellow missionaries, Father Jean-Marie de la Veille, had raised enough funds to allow the repatriation of a number of kidnapped Vietnamese women. Monsignor Gauthier claimed that de la Veille managed to buy back and set free 19 victims. 3 years later, Father de la Vey raised enough money to again purchase Vietnamese women and children who had been kidnapped and sold in China. At least 35 children were included in the repatriation. Besides Father Delave, another missionary, Father Emile Alphonse Mieux, is noted for trying to suppress the trade of women from Annam. So clearly, there was already a bustling slave trade, despicable as that sounds. It's just that, still, according to LaSalle, this trade increased significantly during French colonial rule between 1885 and 1935. She argues that colonial rule, quote, actually created circumstances that often abetted various forms of smuggling. As research on contemporary forms of human trafficking suggests, the trafficking in people goes hand in hand with a number of other social changes. Unquote. Similarly, Christian Rio writes that human trafficking was widespread in Vietnam before and during French rule. He specifically means the trafficking of women who were sold as servants, wives, and prostitutes in China. Both of these scholars agree that colonization may have actually accelerated the slave trade. How? Well, because the French needed to carry out the commercial trade with Europe and China, they developed better systems to communicate. The traffickers, being the enterprising people that they were, latched onto the same system and used it to transport their human cargo faster and more efficiently. The French colonial government built roads, created port cities, and quickly developed rail lines linking Vietnam to China. Criminal elements took advantage of these new technologies. It also didn't help that the French had monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium, which meant that a very big black market developed right under their noses. Here I'm gonna just give you a chronological version of some of the events that give us an idea of how big this trade was. In 1885, Monsignor Puginet wrote that fearing an imminent attack, some women and children from Annam had sought refuge in Sontai and Hanoi. Those who hailed from the same villages in western Tonkin and had chosen to stay behind had been captured by the Black Flags, or armed bandits or pirates. In 1886, the traveler N. Haldwin, writing under the pseudonym Dick de Lonlay, published a book in Paris in which he said he witnessed the capture of a Chinese junk in which 70 Vietnamese, specifically 25 women and 45 children, had been hidden. He said they had been kidnapped in the area of Nam Dinh and were on their way to Pak Hoi to be sold on the Grand Marché Chinois, big Chinese market of that town. The French physician Hocard reported that to keep them quiet while being transported in special boats made to hide illicit cargo, they were often drugged with opium. In 1887, the newspaper L'Avenir de Tonkin reported that French troops liberated more than 200 women and children who had been held captive by Chinese armed bands. In 1889, the dossiers of the colonial government said, quote, the women captured by the pirates of the Delta or of the high plateaus are handed over in exchange for arms and munitions and opium, either to Chinese bands along the border or to the pirates of the Cat bound the coast. Others are boarded clandestinely in Haiphong on ships heading to Hong Kong, or they are sometimes brought to China by false Chinese parents who, under the circumstances, force them to change into Chinese-style clothing so they will pass for young Chinese. These young Vietnamese girls, who are in fact destined to prostitution, and the parents are given regular passports with the mention, traveling with his or her children. Unquote. Things were so bad, and so openly bad, that in 1898, Louis de Grandmaison wrote that of all the activities of the pirates, the most developed was certainly that of the export of women. He wrote that women from Annam were very much in demand and that many of them actually fared better in China than in their native villages. That's interesting because I have no idea what he's basing that judgment on. He also mentioned the existence of Chinese clandestine agencies scattered throughout Tonkin that actively recruited Vietnamese women. They were a well organized network linked to inns and hotels along the routes used to transport the women to China. Obviously, everyone knew about this, and the French colonial government was trying to stop the slave trade in one way or another, but it wasn't really working. And please note that these are from official accounts, so these are their version of events. The Chinese bandits were in cahoots with some Vietnamese actors as well. For example, the French Colonel Selvier arrested a Chinese man named Trin Duc. This man kidnapped five Vietnamese women whom he had hoped to sell in China. Selvier had Trin Duc executed, but before he was executed, he ratted out two elderly women in Hanoi named Me Lu and Mi Duong, who were allegedly his accomplices. By the 1890s, colonial newspapers like L'Avenir de Tonkin and L'Indépendance de Tonkinoise were reporting about the kidnappings. L'Indépendance de Tonkinoise, in particular, reported literally hundreds of kidnappings in articles about the French colonial pacification campaigns in northern Vietnam. Whenever French military operations were successful, it also mentioned women and children they had liberated from the bandits. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the names of these girls, just citations of survivors and some of their ages. One was 9, another was 17, for example. In May of 1891, the Governor General of Indochina requested the intervention of the Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Peking court to help end human trafficking. It really did sound like they were in way over their heads on this one. French ambassadors in China were having trouble as well. In 1894, the French consul at Longzhou reported that armed bands were planning to attack the consulate because they were housing Vietnamese women who escaped the slave trade. At the time, treaties negotiated between France and China didn't include how to manage the issue of kidnapped colonial subjects, with China seeing them as their property and little more than that. They also tried to police the borders, but then trafficking also went on in the ports, which were harder to manage. Sometimes their strict measures ended in tragedy. In 1908, Vietnamese women were thrown overboard by their captors as French authorities approached to get rid of the evidence. By 1909, punishment for those caught ranged from 6 months to 2 years in prison, 3 years if minors were involved, and 5 years if they trafficked their own family members. Over in Longzhou, remember where the consulate was almost attacked? 5 men were actually executed for trafficking in 1912. We know that women who fell victim to the slave trade were often forced into prostitution. And while the French colonial government was outwardly trying to eliminate the slave trade, they didn't outlaw prostitution. There's a bit of a dissonance there, I know. Enlio writes, in colonial Indochina, women involved in prostitution came under the severe, though inefficient, system of registration and control by the authorities. For example, we know from Isabel Trecolhuin's work on prostitutes in Hanoi that authorities regulated these women's bodies. That wasn't because they cared about the women's well being, but because they wanted to monitor and contain the risk of venereal diseases. They were looking out for the French troops, in short. So while we're talking about the French colonial administration's effort to combat the slave trade, let's not forget this other aspect of the situation. The first regional overview on the traffic in women and children across Asia was published in 1932 by the League of Nations. In it, they mentioned the slave trades in China and how the trade was still active in the border areas along the coast of Tonkin. Interestingly, the report mentioned how traffickers used elderly women as collaborators. Allegedly, these elderly women, who had no other way to make money, used their perceived vulnerability to lure young Vietnamese women to cross the border. So, given all this, we know that the slave trade in women and children continued well into the 1920s and 1930s. After that, of course, a different kind of slave trading in women arose. I really wanted to do this episode to illustrate a side of colonial history that isn't often talked about and one that cuts across gender and socioeconomic status. In the case of Vietnam, we, as in non Vietnamese people, Hear more often about figures like the Trung sisters or the women who fought during the Vietnam War in 1955 to 1975. So, this episode is a small tribute to all the now anonymous women who suffered during the slave trade in colonial Indochina. While our discussion here isn't comprehensive, this is one small way we can remember them. We'll pick this topic back up in the next season when we talk about the women forced into sexual slavery in World War II. In the next episode, we're going back to the Philippines where we're talking about the Katipuneras, and I'll also be telling you about my trip to Museo El Deposito. Shout out to our patrons Shireen, Geranion, Shamay Bemilish, Jennifer, Christina, Raymond, Matt, Ashley, Shireen, Chanda, and Yati. And thank you to everyone who subscribed to the Spotify and YouTube channels recently. You can head over to the Patreon right now to listen to several bonus episodes, including Paz Marquez Benitez and Dead Stars, The Portrait of Dada Rasami, The Women of Number 14 Lebulit, and the most recent one, Editors at Large, Ludu Dao Amar and Mama Lay of Burma. Along with the bonus episodes, you get access to full scripts and reference materials, and of course, a channel in which we could communicate if you have any suggestions. Don't forget to follow this podcast on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram at Her Story C Pod. That's Her Story SEA Pod. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agus Ramirez. See you next time.